In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic and landed in the Americas. This discovery sparked centuries of exploration, colonization, and conflict. Millions of lives were lost as European powers fought for control of the New World. From this struggle, a new nation would eventually rise. On July 4, 1776, the United States of America was born. Since then, it has grown into a global superpower, often compared to the Roman Empire. But can its dominance last forever? To answer that, we need to start at the very beginning. Long before Europeans arrived, native peoples lived across North America. They had built complex societies, governed their own lands, and thrived for thousands of years. By the time Europeans arrived in the 15th century, Native Americans had already established powerful communities and traditions. This vast, resource-rich continent soon drew the attention of explorers. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, a Viking from Greenland, sailed west after hearing stories of a distant land. He reached what is now Newfoundland, and his settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows became the first known European outpost in North America. But within 20 years, it was abandoned. For nearly 500 years after, no Europeans returned. By the late 1400s, European nations were searching for faster trade routes to Asia. Instead, they stumbled upon the Americas. In October 1492, Columbus, sailing for Spain, reached the Caribbean. Soon after, explorers and traders from Spain, England, France, Portugal, and the Netherlands claimed lands for themselves. The New World was mapped and named after Amerigo Vespucci, the explorer who described it as a separate continent. While most early voyages focused on the Caribbean and South America, explorers soon turned north toward the vast lands of North America. In 1497, John Cabot, sailing for England, reached Newfoundland. To the south, Spanish explorers like Juan Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto mapped Florida and the southeast. To the north, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River for France, while Giovanni da Verrazzano charted the east coast. Everywhere they went, they met native tribes, sometimes trading peacefully, other times clashing violently. But the greatest impact came from disease. Smallpox and influenza devastated native communities, killing millions who had no immunity. By the mid-1500s, Europeans began attempting permanent settlements. Success was rare. In 1585, the English tried to establish a colony on Roanoke Island, off modern-day North Carolina. Supplies were scarce, and relations with local tribes turned violent. The settlement was abandoned. In 1587, a new group of settlers, mostly families from London, tried again, this time on nearby Croatoan Island. But they faced hunger, disease, and isolation. When a supply ship finally returned in 1590, the colony was gone. The only clue, the word Croatoan carved into a post. The fate of the lost colony of Roanoke remains a mystery to this day. In 1564, French Huguenots tried to start a colony in Florida, but the Spanish saw them as rivals. The Spanish attacked, destroying the settlement and killing nearly all the men. Soon after, Spain established its own colony at St. Augustine. This became the first permanent European settlement in North America. In 1607, the English made another attempt. Backed by the London Company, they built a settlement along the James River in Virginia. They called it Jamestown. At first, the colony grew quickly. Houses, meeting halls, and a defensive fort were built. But survival was not easy. Relations with the Powhatan tribes started with conflict, then slowly improved. The Powhatan provided food and guidance while settlers searched for gold. Instead, they found disease and harsh living conditions. Jamestown nearly collapsed until Captain John Smith took charge. He enforced strict discipline, pushed settlers to farm, and strengthened trade with the Powhatan. Smith's leadership helped Jamestown endure its hardest years. Over time, it became the first successful English settlement in America. By 1619, Jamestown became the site of another historic first, the arrival of enslaved Africans. Around 20 men and women, captured from a Spanish slave ship, were brought to Virginia. Some were traded directly to Jamestown. This marked the beginning of over 2 centuries of slavery, in what would later become the United States. In 1620, another group of English settlers, the Puritans or Pilgrims, arrived in search of religious freedom. They crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower, enduring a brutal voyage. When they landed at Provincetown, they worried about their legal rights. To keep order, they signed the Mayflower Compact, agreeing to govern themselves while still pledging loyalty to England. Soon, the Pilgrims moved north and settled at Plymouth Harbor. They built their homes on the site of a former Patuxet village. Their first winter was harsh, with many living on the ship while building shelters. But in 1621, they met the Wampanoag tribe. Through Squanto, a Patuxet who spoke English, they formed an alliance with Chief Massasoit. That fall, they held a 3-day feast with the Wampanoag, remembered as the first Thanksgiving. Like Jamestown, Plymouth survived, and more English settlers followed. By the mid-1600s, colonies spread throughout New England and beyond. Plymouth eventually merged into the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony. Other European powers also claimed land. The Dutch settled in the Northeast, building New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island in 1624. It grew into a thriving trading hub. But in 1664, the English seized it without bloodshed and renamed it New York. Meanwhile, Spain expanded north from St. Augustine, pushing into the southeast, the Midwest, and across to the west. France, focused on the fur trade, established Quebec, Montreal, and New Orleans. By the early 1700s, the French controlled much of the Mississippi River and the interior of North America. But conflict was constant. Native tribes resisted European expansion. Raids, alliances, and battles shaped the frontier. One of the bloodiest conflicts came in 1675 with King Philip's War. Metacomet, son of Massasoit, united Algonquian tribes against the English settlers. The war devastated New England, wiping out entire native communities. Metacomet was killed, and his people were forced from their lands. European rivalries spilled into America as well. England and France fought a series of wars, often using native allies on both sides. King William's War in 1689, Queen Anne's War in 1702, and King George's War in 1744 all left scars across the colonies. Settlements were raided, territories shifted, but no lasting peace was found. Slavery also grew during this period. The transatlantic trade, known as the Triangle Trade, brought millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Ships carried slaves to the New World, transported sugar and tobacco back to Europe, and returned to Africa for more human cargo. By the mid-17th century, more than 2 million Africans had been forced across the ocean. By the 1750s, tensions between Britain and France reached a breaking point. In 1753, Virginia's lieutenant governor sent a young officer named George Washington to the Ohio River Valley. His mission: to remove the French from forts built in the region. When diplomacy failed, Washington was sent back, this time with orders to use force. The stage was set for the French and Indian War. In April 1754, French troops learned from their native allies, the Mingos, that the British had built a small fort in the Ohio Valley. The French marched in, captured it, and built a stronger fort on the site. They named it Fort Duquesne. Meanwhile, further south, a young Colonel George Washington led a small force of colonial militia, joined by native allies. They surprised a French encampment and quickly overwhelmed them, but the victory turned bloody. Washington's native ally, Tonnagrisson, killed the wounded French commander. This shocked Washington, who feared retaliation. He hastily built a crude defense, Fort Necessity. It was soon surrounded. The French forced Washington to surrender. This small skirmish set the world on fire. Virginia's governor called for help. Britain sent troops. France reinforced its forts. Soon, war erupted. In America, it was called the French and Indian War. In Europe, it became the 7 Years' War, the largest global war yet. At first, the British lost badly. They were defeated at Fort Ticonderoga and Fort William Henry. French forces seemed unstoppable. But by 1758, the tide turned. Britain's navy cut off French supplies. Colonial and British troops captured Fort Niagara, Louisbourg, and Quebec. By 1760, France surrendered Canada. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the war. Britain gained Canada, the Louisiana Territory east of the Mississippi, and key Caribbean islands. But the victory came at a cost. Casualties were enormous. Nearly 1.4 million across the globe, 23,000 in North America alone. Britain emerged as the dominant empire. Its colonies in America grew rapidly, from 250,000 people in 1700 to over 1.25 million by 1750. The colonies produced vital resources for the empire: hemp, tar, copper. Religion also shaped this period. The Great Awakening, a wave of evangelical revival, swept across Europe and America. Traveling preachers drew massive crowds. In 1740, George Whitefield preached to 30,000 in Boston, nearly twice the city's population. The revival strengthened Protestant identity in the colonies. Many future revolutionaries grew up in its wake. After the war, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists, eager for land, ignored it. Tensions rose. Britain, deep in debt, taxed the colonies to pay for the war. The Sugar Act of 1764 regulated trade, favoring British goods. Colonists resisted with boycotts. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, taxing newspapers, legal papers, even playing cards. Outrage spread. Secret groups like the Sons of Liberty threatened stamp agents. Riots broke out. 9 colonies united at the Stamp Act Congress, declaring taxation without representation a violation of their rights. Britain repealed the Stamp Act but insisted it still had authority. The door to future conflict was left wide open. In 1767, Chancellor Charles Townshend imposed new taxes on glass, paint, paper, and tea. Colonists erupted again. Pamphlets, protests, and boycotts spread. In Boston, mobs forced customs officials out. Britain sent troops to restore order. On March 5, 1770, tensions exploded. A crowd harassed a British sentry at the Boston Customs House. Reinforcements arrived. Surrounded by hundreds, pelted with ice and stones, one soldier fired by accident. Others followed. 5 colonists were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a formerly enslaved man. This became known as the Boston Massacre. Though John Adams defended the soldiers in court, calling for justice, the damage was done. Patriots used the massacre as proof of British tyranny. Tensions briefly cooled. Until tea. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the East India Company a monopoly. Colonists saw it as another attack on liberty. That December, the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party enraged Britain. In response, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts in 1774. Boston's port was closed. Massachusetts lost self-rule. British troops could be housed in private buildings. Colonists saw their rights stripped away. In September, 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They petitioned the king and organized boycotts. The petition was ignored. In April 1775, British troops marched to seize weapons at Concord. Paul Revere and others rode to warn the militia. At dawn on April 19th, on the Lexington Green, colonial militia faced British regulars. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired. The war had begun. The rebellion spread. In June 1775, militias clashed with British troops at Bunker Hill. The British won, but with heavy losses. It was clear this would not be an easy fight. The Continental Congress created a united army. George Washington, once a colonial officer in the French and Indian War, was chosen to command. At first, the Continental Army struggled, short on food, divided by colony, and lacking discipline. Washington worked to unite them. In early 1776, Henry Knox hauled captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. With artillery aimed from Dorchester Heights, the British evacuated the city. The war spread south and west. In New York, Washington braced for a major British attack. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Congress realized reconciliation was impossible. On July 4, 1776, they adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson. The colonies declared themselves free states, no longer subjects of the Crown. What began as a fight for rights as British citizens had become a revolution for independence. The Declaration of Independence declared it boldly. All men are created equal. They are endowed with unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The document transformed the struggle. It was no longer a rebellion. It was a revolution. In New York, Washington read the Declaration aloud to his soldiers. Spirits soared. At last, they fought not just against Britain, but for independence itself. But Britain struck back. In August 1776, they launched a crushing campaign around New York City. Washington's army, outmatched and unprepared, lost 5 battles in a row. Forced to retreat across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, morale sank. Yet Washington refused to give up. On Christmas night, 1776, in a blinding storm, he led his men across the Delaware River. They struck at Trenton, surprising the Hessians, German troops hired by Britain. Washington won a swift victory. Days later, he won again at Princeton. These triumphs kept the Revolution alive in its darkest hour. The British pressed harder in 1777. Howe captured Philadelphia after victories at Brandywine and Germantown. Washington's battered army withdrew to Valley Forge. That winter was brutal, cold, hungry, desperate. But it also became a turning point. With the help of Lafayette and Baron von Steuben, the army trained, drilled, and became a true fighting force. Meanwhile, in New York, British General Burgoyne marched south from Canada, hoping to cut off New England. But at Saratoga, he was defeated by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. In October 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, 7,000 men. This was the turning point. France now believed America could win. Hungry for revenge, the French declared war on Britain and allied with the United States. Suddenly, the Revolution was a global war. In 1778, Washington's rebuilt army proved itself at Monmouth, fighting the British to a draw in open battle. Britain soon abandoned Philadelphia, retreating to New York. From then on, the fighting shifted south. In 1779, British forces seized Savannah and Charleston. At Camden, they crushed General Gates. Washington placed Nathanael Greene in command. Greene waged a relentless campaign, harassing supply lines, rallying militias, and forcing Britain deeper into hostile territory. Victories at Kings Mountain and Cowpens broke British momentum. By 1781, General Cornwallis was exhausted. He retreated to Yorktown, Virginia. There, American and French forces surrounded him. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. Yorktown was the final major battle of the Revolution. Peace talks began. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States as a free and independent nation. But independence brought new challenges. In 1777, the Continental Congress had adopted the Articles of Confederation. It created only a weak central government. During the war, it held the states together. But in peace, it quickly failed. Each state controlled its own trade, currency, and taxes. Disputes over boundaries and debt grew worse. Britain, claiming treaty violations, refused to leave forts on American soil. Congress had no power to force compliance. The breaking point came in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion. Angry over debt and foreclosures, veterans in Massachusetts rose up under Daniel Shays. They attacked courts and threatened an arsenal. Though defeated, their revolt revealed the weakness of the Articles. The nation needed something stronger. In May 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia. At first, they planned to revise the Articles. Instead, they wrote something entirely new: the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution created three branches of government: a legislature, Congress, to make laws; an executive, the President, to enforce them; a judiciary, the Supreme Court, to interpret them. Checks and balances were built into every level. Compromises balanced power between big states and small states, North and South. Debate raged between Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who feared a strong central government. But by 1788, enough states ratified it. The United States had a new foundation. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president. John Adams became vice president. Washington shaped the new office with dignity and restraint. He created a cabinet, balanced rival factions, and guided the fragile republic. He faced rebellion at home, the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Farmers in Pennsylvania resisted attacks on whiskey. Washington personally led troops to restore order, proving the government had real authority. He faced foreign crises, too. France was in revolution. Britain seized American ships. Pirates attacked U.S. trade. Washington urged neutrality, warning against permanent alliances. His farewell after 2 terms set a precedent: the peaceful transfer of power. John Adams followed in 1797. His presidency was stormy. With France, he faced the quasi-war, naval battles without a formal declaration. At home, the Alien and Sedition Acts sparked outrage, seen as attacks on free speech. Adams preserved peace, but lost re-election. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson became president. His victory marked the first peaceful transfer of power between rival parties. Jefferson cut government spending, reduced the military, and repealed unpopular taxes. But he also doubled the size of the nation with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. To explore it, Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark. Guided by Sacagawea, they mapped rivers, contacted tribes, and recorded hundreds of species. Their journey opened the West, but Jefferson's second term faltered. Britain and France attacked American trade. His embargo backfired, crippling the economy. James Madison followed in 1809. Pressured by war hawks, he declared war on Britain in 1812. America was unprepared. Invasions of Canada failed. The British burned Washington, D.C. But victories at sea and at New Orleans, led by Andrew Jackson, gave Americans pride. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war in 1814. No land changed hands, but America had stood against the world's greatest empire and survived. The young nation now looked west. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, Britain's retreat, and Spain's weakening grip opened vast new lands. The idea of manifest destiny took root. The belief that America was meant to stretch from ocean to ocean. But expansion came at a cost. Native nations were displaced. In 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, forcing entire tribes westward along the Trail of Tears. Thousands died. Meanwhile, settlers poured west by wagon, boat, and horseback. They followed trails to Oregon, Utah, and California. The gold rush of 1849 drew thousands more. Towns boomed, fortunes were made, and lost. The United States was growing rapidly, but beneath the triumph lay tension. Native resistance, economic conflict, and the question of slavery loomed over the expanding republic. The stage was set for even greater struggles to come. In 1846, the annexation of Texas set off a new conflict with Mexico. The borders of Texas were disputed, and Mexico claimed that the United States had seized its land. President James K. Polk tried to negotiate, even offering money for Texas, California, New Mexico, and Arizona. But when Mexico refused, Polk sent troops into the contested area. A clash followed, and soon Congress declared war. The Mexican army, still using outdated weapons and crippled by poor leadership, was no match for the modern, well-organized American forces. Within 2 years, Mexico was defeated. The United States seized vast territories including California, New Mexico, and Texas, displaying its growing ambition to control the continent. But this expansion reignited a deeper struggle: the future of slavery. For decades, the balance between free states and slave states had been fragile. Each new territory raised the same question: would it allow slavery or ban it? This tension split the nation apart. Since the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, slavery had become rooted in America, especially in the South. Though the international slave trade ended in 1808, generations of African Americans were still held in bondage. Some fought back in rebellion, while others risked everything to escape north on the Underground Railroad. Brave men and women like Harriet Tubman guided hundreds to freedom, despite the danger. As arguments grew, violence began to spill over. In 1854, a shocking moment shook Congress itself. Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina stormed the Senate floor and beat Senator Charles Sumner with a cane. To Southerners, Brooks was a hero. To Northerners, it was proof that compromise was breaking down. Soon the conflict turned deadly in the territories. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in a bloody struggle known as Bleeding Kansas. Among the most radical voices was John Brown, an abolitionist preacher who believed only violence could end slavery. In 1859, he led a raid on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to spark a slave uprising. The plan failed. Brown was captured by U.S. troops under Robert E. Lee and executed. To the south, he was a madman. To the north, a martyr. Just 2 years later, the storm broke. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. For 4 years, The Union and Confederacy fought in some of the bloodiest battles in history. In the East, General Robert E. Lee kept the Confederacy alive with brilliant strategy. In the West, General Ulysses S. Grant led the Union to key victories, seizing the Mississippi River and splitting the South. Turning points came in 1863, Grant's triumph at Vicksburg and the Union victory at Gettysburg. The tide of the war began to shift. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman then marched through Georgia, burning Atlanta and leaving a path of destruction. By April 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederacy was defeated, and the Union preserved. But victory brought heartbreak. Just days after the surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. The country mourned the loss of the man who had saved the Union. In the years that followed, the United States entered Reconstruction. New constitutional amendments ended slavery, granted citizenship to former slaves, and gave black men the right to vote. Federal troops were stationed in the South to enforce these laws, but resistance was fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose in violence, determined to maintain white dominance. At the same time, America looked west. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. What had once been a journey of months now took less than a week. The railroad fueled westward expansion, but also brought lawlessness. Frontier towns became notorious for gambling, drinking, and violence. In Tombstone, Arizona, the famous gunfight at the OK Corral symbolized the rough and dangerous life of the Wild West. Meanwhile, the nation was changing rapidly. Millions of immigrants arrived, seeking opportunity. Industry boomed. Railroads, coal and steel transformed America into a modern powerhouse. Yet wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, while poverty spread among the many. The era became known as the Gilded Age, an age of growth, but also corruption, inequality, and rising tensions. And though slavery had ended, its legacy lived on. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, Southern states imposed Jim Crow laws, enforcing racial segregation and stripping Black Americans of their rights. Violence and oppression continued for generations, even as America marched forward into the new century. By the late 1800s, railroads had become the backbone of the American economy. They carried wheat, cattle, timber, and silver across the country, tying distant regions together. The first transcontinental railroad opened in 1869, and by 1890, nearly 800,000 people were employed by the rail industry. But railroad work was dangerous and poorly paid. As machines replaced skilled workers with unskilled laborers, wages fell and inequality grew. By the end of the century, the richest 10% of Americans owned more than 3/4 of the nation's wealth. This imbalance, combined with harsh working conditions, sparked waves of strikes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 lasted more than 50 days and only ended when federal troops intervened, leaving over 100 people dead. In 1886, during another major strike, a rally at Chicago's Haymarket Square turned violent when a bomb exploded. The blast killed police and protesters alike, and in the aftermath, 8 labor organizers were convicted, some executed. To many Americans, they became martyrs, but the incident also fueled anti-labor sentiment. Strikes continued. In 1894, the Pullman strike spread across 27 states, with up to 250,000 workers refusing to handle Pullman train cars. Anger escalated into riots. Rail cars were burned, and the federal government sent troops to break the strike. Dozens were killed. Millions of dollars in property was destroyed, and the strikers lost over $1 million in wages. To calm tensions, President Grover Cleveland declared Labor Day a national holiday, but resentment remained. Meanwhile, industrial tycoons like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan built vast fortunes. Admirers called them great philanthropists, but critics branded them robber barons for exploiting workers and crushing competition. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed these abuses. Upton Sinclair revealed the horrors of the meatpacking industry. Ida Tarbell dismantled Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly, and Jacob Riis shocked the public with photographs of life in New York's slums. The contrast between wealth and poverty was stark. Slums grew crowded while the wealthy funded great projects, bridges, skyscrapers, subways, and the spread of electricity. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, stood as a symbol of American progress, though its construction cost many workers their health and lives. But prosperity was fragile. In 1893, overbuilding and risky investments triggered a financial panic. Banks collapsed, railroads went bankrupt, unemployment soared, and families starved. President Cleveland was blamed, and his party suffered heavy political losses. At the same time, the United States expanded beyond its borders. In Hawaii, American settlers and business interests overthrew Queen Liliuokalani in 1893, establishing a U.S.-backed provisional government. In Cuba, a rebellion against Spain drew sympathy in America. And when the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, cries of "Remember the Maine" pushed the U.S. into war with Spain in 1898. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months. The U.S. Navy destroyed Spanish fleets in the Philippines and Cuba, while Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders captured San Juan Hill. Spain quickly surrendered. By the Treaty of Paris, the U.S. gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while also annexing Hawaii. The United States emerged from the war a global power. At home, the progressive era began. Reformers worked to curb the excesses of the Gilded Age, tackling unsafe working conditions, corruption, and corporate monopolies. President Theodore Roosevelt became known as a trust buster, breaking up giant companies and pushing for consumer protections. Social reformers like Jane Addams founded settlement houses to aid poor immigrants, while others fought for public health, temperance, and women's suffrage. But progress was uneven. African Americans in the South faced harsh segregation, disenfranchisement, and racial violence during what became known as the nadir of race relations. Many fled north during the Great Migration, only to face new forms of prejudice in cities. At the same time, women's organizations campaigned for the right to vote, linking it to broader reforms such as ending child labor and banning alcohol. By the early 20th century, the United States had transformed. It was industrial, urban, and increasingly global. Yet beneath its rapid growth lay deep divisions over race, class, and equality, divisions that would continue to shape the century ahead. In 1916, Alice Paul founded the National Women's Party, determined to win women the right to vote nationwide. When America entered World War I in 1917, women stepped into workplaces that had previously been closed to them, taking on jobs left vacant by men who went off to fight. That momentum helped secure the passage of the 19th Amendment, adopted on August 18, 1920. It guaranteed women the right to vote, marking a turning point in American democracy. Meanwhile, the United States sought to prove itself on the world stage. One frontier that captured the public's imagination was the race to reach the North Pole. In 1909, Robert Peary announced he had arrived at the pole, but another explorer, Frederick Cook, claimed he had reached it the year before. The controversy drew massive attention, with newspapers polling readers on who they believed. A congressional subcommittee eventually gave Peary official recognition for his Arctic exploration, though the question of who truly reached the pole first remains unsettled to this day. At the same time, the U.S. undertook one of the most ambitious engineering projects in history, the Panama Canal. Taking over from the French in 1904, American workers carved a 50-mile waterway through mountains, jungles, and swamps. They fought back deadly mosquito-borne diseases and designed a revolutionary system of locks to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The canal opened on August 15, 1914. It cost $375 million, at the time the most expensive project in U.S. history, and thousands of lives. Despite its high cost, it transformed global trade and became one of the great achievements of the progressive era. While these projects showcased progress, the outbreak of World War I in 1914 presented new challenges. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality, but after a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania in 1915, killing 128 Americans, public opinion began to shift. In 1917, the infamous Zimmermann telegram revealed Germany's plan to ally with Mexico if the U.S. entered the war. Outrage swept the nation, and on April 6th, Congress declared war on Germany. The Selective Service Act drafted nearly 3 million men, while millions more volunteered. At home, German Americans faced suspicion, registration, and even internment. To support the war effort, the government created new agencies, produced propaganda through the Committee on Public Information, and encouraged citizens to grow victory gardens. Taxes and war bonds helped fund the fight. Women again played a crucial role, working in factories, serving as nurses, and even becoming switchboard operators on the Western Front. By 1918, American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 10,000 a day. Their presence boosted Allied morale and helped turn the tide. In the Meuse-Argonne offensive, more than 1 million Americans pushed German forces back. Over 26,000 U.S. soldiers died, but their efforts helped bring an end to the war. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. In less than a year of combat, the U.S. had lost over 53,000 men in battle and more than 63,000 to accidents and disease. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson presented his 14 points, including a plan for a League of Nations. But the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and America instead signed its own peace with Germany in 1921. The 1920s that followed became known as the Roaring Twenties. The economy boomed, consumer goods like automobiles and radios became widespread, and for the first time, most Americans lived in cities. Women gained new independence, going out to dance halls, amusement parks, and movie theaters. The work week shortened, wages rose, and people bought more than ever before, often on credit. Cultural life flourished. Movies drew millions each week. Mass-produced fashion became affordable, and radios connected households across the nation. Jazz, pioneered by black musicians from New Orleans and popularized in Chicago and New York, electrified the nightlife. Stars like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington filled clubs, while the Harlem Renaissance showcased black art, poetry, and music. But not everyone embraced these changes. Jazz faced racist backlash, and groups like the Ku Klux Klan grew to millions of members, spreading violence and hatred across the country. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 left entire black neighborhoods destroyed. At the same time, new immigration laws sharply restricted arrivals from Eastern Europe and Asia, reflecting a rise in nativism. Prohibition, introduced in 1920, banned the sale of alcohol nationwide. Instead of eliminating drinking, it fueled smuggling, speakeasies, and organized crime. Figures like Al Capone built empires on bootleg liquor, while corruption spread through law enforcement. By the end of the decade, cracks began to show. Overconfidence in the stock market, rising debt, and slowing consumer demand led to the crash of October 1929. The Great Depression had begun. Unemployment skyrocketed, banks collapsed, and families lost their homes. In the Dust Bowl, drought and storms devastated farms, forcing thousands to migrate in search of work. President Herbert Hoover resisted direct government aid, but when Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected in 1932, he launched the New Deal. Programs like the Works Progress Administration put millions back to work, building schools, bridges, airports, and even Mount Rushmore. Social Security was created, labor protections were expanded, and federal housing programs took shape. These reforms didn't end the Depression, but they reshaped the role of government and gave hope to millions. That hope was soon tested again. In 1939, World War II began in Europe. At first, Americans favored staying out, but after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the U.S. entered the war. The nation mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Millions of men went to fight, while millions at home produced weapons, food, and supplies. Yet fear also fueled injustice. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were forced into internment camps. Abroad, American forces joined the Allies in North Africa, Italy, and France. On June 6, 1944, D-Day marked the turning point in Europe as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. In the Pacific, a brutal island-hopping campaign brought U.S. forces closer to Japan, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. By 1945, Germany was collapsing under pressure from both East and West. Hitler committed suicide, and the war in Europe ended. The United States, now a superpower, had helped decide the fate of the world once again. In the Pacific, island after island fell to the American advance. By the spring of 1945, the U.S. military was preparing for an invasion of Japan itself. Everyone knew it would be a brutal and costly fight. That April, tragedy struck at home. President Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly, leaving Vice President Harry Truman to take office. Almost immediately, Truman was told about a secret project, one that could change the course of the war. It was called the Manhattan Project. Led by physicist Robert Oppenheimer, it brought together the greatest scientific minds of the age. Their mission, to build a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. An atomic bomb. Now the decision rested with Truman. Japan showed no signs of surrender. Military planners warned that a ground invasion could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, and far more Japanese. Truman chose to use the bomb. On the morning of August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., a B-29 bomber released Little Boy, a uranium bomb, over the city of Hiroshima. It detonated a mile above the ground with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion was blinding. The fireball stretched nearly 2 miles across and burned as hot as the surface of the sun. People at the center were vaporized instantly. Their shadows burned into stone. Concrete buildings crumbled. Wood and paper houses vanished in flames. In the days and weeks that followed, tens of thousands died from injuries and radiation. By the end, between 80,000 and 140,000 people were dead. Still, Japan refused to surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, the United States dropped a second bomb. This one, a plutonium weapon called Fat Man, exploded over Nagasaki's industrial valley. It was even more powerful than Little Boy. The surrounding mountains contained some of the blast, but the destruction was still immense. between 60,000 and 80,000 people were killed. Together, the two bombings took as many as 226,000 lives, most of them civilians. The message was clear. On August 10th, Japan signaled its willingness to surrender. Though some leaders tried to resist until the very end, a coup was attempted inside Tokyo, but it quickly failed. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to the nation. Japan would surrender. World War II was over. More than 16 million Americans had served in the armed forces. Over 420,000 never came home. The United States emerged from the war not just victorious, but transformed. Isolation was gone. America was now a global superpower and carried the weight of shaping the post-war world. But with the dawn of atomic warfare, a new and dangerous era had begun. Despite fighting together against Nazi Germany, the United States and the Soviet Union were never true allies. The U.S. distrusted Stalin's dictatorship and communism. The Soviets, in turn, resented America's global ambitions. This tension became the Cold War. Direct fighting never broke out between the two powers. Both sides knew atomic weapons made total war unthinkable. Instead, the U.S. adopted a strategy called containment, aiming to stop the spread of Soviet influence. This rivalry fueled an unprecedented arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tested their own atomic bomb. By 1952, the U.S. had gone further, detonating the first hydrogen bomb in the Marshall Islands, a weapon hundreds of times stronger than those dropped on Japan. The Soviets followed in 1955 with their own test in Kazakhstan. These blasts left scars on the people and lands nearby, but testing only accelerated. By 1958, over 100 bombs had been detonated worldwide. At home, the Cold War reshaped American life. Fear of nuclear war led schools to run drills and families to build bomb shelters in their backyards. Fear of communism led to suspicion, investigations, and blacklists. In 1947, Congress created the House Un-American Activities Committee. It investigated thousands of federal workers, professors, and even Hollywood actors and writers. Many lost their jobs and reputations, not because of crimes, but because of political beliefs. This wave of paranoia became known as the Red Scare, and one of its most vocal figures, Senator Joseph McCarthy, gave it another name, McCarthyism. Overseas, Cold War tensions reshaped the world. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up, dividing East and West Germany. Officially, it was meant to keep Western influence out, but in truth, it was built to stop East Germans from fleeing to the West. The wall became one of the most iconic symbols of the Cold War. The standoff reached its most dangerous point in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being built just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 tense days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade around Cuba. Soviet ships approached. Military forces prepared for the worst. Finally, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba, and the secret removal of American missiles in Turkey. Disaster had been avoided, but Cold War rivalries played out far beyond Cuba and Berlin. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The U.S., backed by the United Nations, rushed to defend the South. After 3 years of brutal fighting and millions of deaths, the war ended in a stalemate. Soon after, America became involved in Vietnam. What began as limited support in the 1950s turned into a full-scale war by the 1960s. Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon all escalated U.S. involvement. The domino theory argued that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would follow. But Vietnam became a long, bloody conflict that divided Americans at home and cost over 58,000 U.S. lives. By the 1970s, leaders sought to ease tensions. President Nixon opened talks with the Soviets and even visited communist China. Arms control agreements followed. But in the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, the U.S. took a harder line, pouring money into military buildup and supporting anti-communist movements around the world. The Cold War finally ended in 1991. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms weakened Moscow's control. One by one, Eastern European nations broke free. The Berlin Wall fell. Germany was reunited, and the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The U.S. had outlasted its greatest rival, but the age of nuclear weapons and the tensions they created was far from over. In the spring of 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference launched a campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. They were joined by the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Together, they organized sit-ins, meetings, boycotts, and marches to protest segregation. Activists registered voters and held educational sessions, teaching about nonviolence. The boycotts hit local businesses hard, especially with Easter approaching, one of the busiest shopping seasons. Hundreds of protesters were arrested, filling city jails. By early May, the city tried to stop the protests through a court order. Activists defied it. On May 2nd, over 1,000 African American students marched downtown in what became known as the Children's Crusade. More arrests followed, jails overflowed, and city officials responded with violence. Police used high-pressure hoses and dogs against children and adults. Images of the brutality sparked outrage across the nation and the world. The White House sent a mediator to help negotiate. On May 8th, the Birmingham Truce was reached. Segregation signs were removed, protesters were released on bond, lunch counters began to integrate, and more jobs were opened to African Americans. The compromise was partial. Not all goals were achieved, but the campaign drew national attention and elevated King as a leader. On August 28, 1963, he delivered his historic "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. Around 250,000 people gathered to demand civil and economic rights. King's speech and the march helped inspire two landmark laws: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, ending discrimination in public spaces, education, and employment, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, outlawing racial discrimination in voting. These laws marked the greatest civil rights progress since Reconstruction. Meanwhile, the U.S. was also entangled in Vietnam. The conflict began as a fight between the anti-communist South, led by dictator Ngo Dinh Diem, and communist North Vietnam. Under President Lyndon Johnson, the U.S. escalated its involvement with air raids, bombing campaigns, and eventually hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. Support at home began to fade. Many Americans protested the draft, civilian casualties, and the South Vietnamese government's corruption. Soldiers faced low morale, drug use, and PTSD. Desertions and draft dodging were widespread. Despite this, the war continued for years. The 1968 My Lai massacre, where over 400 unarmed civilians were killed, shocked the nation. By 1973, the U.S. ended active combat, but North Vietnam continued fighting until capturing Saigon in 1975. The war left a heavy toll: millions of Vietnamese dead or wounded, millions displaced, and 58,000 American soldiers killed. The conflict divided the United States deeply. Meanwhile, the Cold War spurred the space race. After World War II, the US and Soviet Union competed to show their technological and political superiority. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, the first satellite to orbit Earth, followed by Sputnik 2 with a dog named Laika. The US responded with Explorer 1 in 1958 and the creation of NASA. Over the next decade, both nations launched satellites, weather and communication probes, and sent humans into space. The Soviet Union took an early lead, sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit in 1961. The U.S. quickly pushed back, landing Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the Moon in 1969. The televised Apollo 11 mission became a defining moment in space exploration. By 1975, the U.S. and USSR even worked together on a joint space mission, symbolically ending the space race. The space race also brought innovations to everyday life. Satellites for communication and weather, CAT scan imaging, shock-absorbent materials, and wireless headsets all trace their origins to this era. In the 1970s, postmodernism reshaped culture, questioning universal truths and focusing on relative perspectives. Meanwhile, social movements continued. Young people protested the Vietnam War, racial injustice, and discrimination against women. The first Earth Day was observed in 1970. Television became a central part of American life. Shows like All in the Family, Saturday Night Live, and Wheel of Fortune premiered. Video games and tech companies, including Apple and Microsoft, began shaping the economy. Economically, the U.S. faced recessions and the oil crisis of 1973. Politically, scandals like Watergate toppled President Nixon, paving the way for Jimmy Carter's presidency. Carter pursued peace abroad, including in the Middle East, and returned the Panama Canal to Panama. Yet the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis in 1979 challenged his presidency. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won the presidency, emphasizing deregulation, tax cuts, and conservative economic policies known as Reaganomics. Despite early recessions, his policies made the wealthiest Americans richer, while middle and lower-income families saw slower gains. The 1980s also saw tragedies and advances: the Challenger space shuttle disaster, the rise of crack cocaine and the war on drugs, and the ongoing AIDS epidemic. The federal government was criticized for slow responses to both crises. George H.W. Bush continued Reagan-era drug policies and led the U.S. in the Gulf War in 1991, quickly defeating Iraq and restoring Kuwaiti sovereignty. By the 1990s, technology reshaped the country. Personal computers and the Internet exploded in use, leading to the dot-com boom. Some companies thrived, like Amazon and Microsoft, while others failed when the bubble burst around 2000. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first African-American president, promising hope during the Great Recession. He implemented reforms to stabilize the economy and oversaw a planned withdrawal from Afghanistan. The 2016 election brought Donald Trump to power, highlighting political divisions and foreign challenges. The U.S. continued its involvement in the Middle East and faced the COVID-19 pandemic, which further tested the nation's resilience. In 2020, Joe Biden was elected president with Kamala Harris as vice president, marking the first African-American and first woman in the role. Under Biden, the U.S. completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan, supported Ukraine during the Russian invasion in 2022, and continues to navigate deep political divisions at home. Through more than 2 centuries, the United States has faced wars, civil rights struggles, economic crises, and social change. Yet, the nation endures. Its people are resilient, its culture innovative, and its diversity unmatched. From humble beginnings to global leadership, the American story is one of challenge, adaptation, and hope. an ongoing experiment in democracy and human progress.